In the dim laboratories of medieval Europe, men bent over furnaces spoke not merely of base metals transforming into gold, but of a marriage, a hieros gamos, between two sovereign principles they named the Red King and the White Queen. This was not the language of chemistry as we understand it today, but rather a coded discourse on the most fundamental tension within human consciousness itself, the dynamic polarity between solar assertion and lunar receptivity, between the active principle of will and the passive principle of wisdom, between doing and being. The historical alchemist, working in secret beneath the suspicious gaze of ecclesiastical authority, developed an elaborate symbolic lexicon precisely because direct speech was dangerous. To speak of inner transformation, of psychological processes that bypassed the Church's monopoly on spiritual development, was to court the accusation of heresy. Thus emerged the extraordinary imagery, the Red King crowned in solar radiance, representing consciousness, directed intention, the masculine principle of sulfur, and the White Queen draped in lunar silver, embodying the unconscious, receptive awareness, the feminine principle of Mercury. These were not gendered prescriptions, but archetypal forces present in every psyche, regardless of biological sex. What the alchemists intuited through their peculiar blend of proto-chemistry and mystical speculation, depth psychology would later articulate with greater precision, that the human being is fundamentally divided, and that this division is not pathological, but constitutive of consciousness itself. Carl Jung, excavating these medieval texts with the eye of a clinician, recognized in the alchemical opus a profound map of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole, not by eliminating internal contradiction, but by consciously holding and integrating it. The question that initiates this exploration is deceptively simple. Why did the alchemists insist that the great work required the union of opposites? Why could the Red King not transmute alone, nor the White Queen achieve the philosopher's stone in isolation? The answer cuts to the heart of psychological maturity, because consciousness divorced from the unconscious produces brittle rationality and spiritual sterility, while the unconscious, untempered by conscious discrimination, results in dissolution and chaos. The marriage of these principles represents nothing less than the forging of an integrated self capable of navigating the full spectrum of human experience without fragmenting into one-sided extremes. The alchemical tradition, despite its obscure symbolism and often contradictory texts, rests upon a coherent philosophical foundation. The principle of correspondence, the notion that macrocosm and microcosm mirror one another, that the processes observed in nature reflect the dynamics of the soul. This was not mere poetic fancy, but a sophisticated epistemological stance. The alchemist understood himself as embedded within a cosmos of meaningful relationships, where the transformation of matter and the transformation of consciousness were not separate endeavors, but parallel expressions of a single underlying process. At the center of this worldview stood the axiom of polarity. Ancient and medieval philosophers, from Heraclitus to the authors of Hermetic texts, insisted that reality itself is constituted by the tension between opposing forces, hot and cold, wet and dry, light and dark, active and passive. This was not dualism in the Gnostic sense, which saw matter as evil and spirit as good, but rather a recognition that dynamism, movement, and life itself emerge from the interaction of complementary opposites. Stasis in this view equaled death. Only through the continual interplay of contraries could anything truly exist or develop. The Red King embodies the solar principle, conscious awareness, directed will, the capacity for analysis, discrimination, and decisive action. In Jungian terms, this corresponds to the ego and its functions, thinking and sensation in their extroverted forms, the orientation toward the objective world, the realm of logos. Alchemically, this is sulfur, the active, fiery principle that seeks to impose form upon chaos, to separate and purify, to create order through intentional effort. Symbolically, the king wears red because he is associated with blood, with life force asserting itself, with the daylight consciousness that names and categorizes experience. The White Queen represents the lunar principle, the unconscious, receptivity, the capacity for synthesis, intuition, and yielding awareness. This is the domain of the soul, of eros rather than logos, of the connecting function that perceives relationships and wholes rather than parts. Alchemically, this is mercury or quicksilver, the volatile, fluid principle that resists fixed form, that dissolves boundaries, that contains potentiality rather than actuality. The queen wears white because she is associated with milk, with the prima materia, with the night consciousness that dreams and imagines and receives impressions without immediately judging or acting upon them. Here we must be scrupulously careful to avoid the trap of crude gender essentialism. The alchemists were not prescribing social roles or claiming that men possess only solar qualities while women possess only lunar ones. On the contrary, the entire point of the alchemical work is that every individual contains both principles in varying proportions and degrees of development. A man who identifies exclusively with the Red King, with rational control, aggressive ambition, and emotional stoicism, has not achieved masculinity but rather one-sidedness. He has repressed his White Queen, his capacity for receptivity, emotional depth and relational intelligence, and this repression will manifest as psychological symptoms, projection onto women, fear of vulnerability, compulsive activity masking inner emptiness. Similarly, a woman who identifies solely with the White Queen, with passivity, intuition, and emotional fluidity, has not achieved femininity, but has instead rejected her Red King, her capacity for assertive boundary setting, clear thinking, and autonomous action. This too produces symptoms: chronic self-sacrifice, inability to articulate needs, confusion of empathy with self-dissolution. The philosophical sophistication of alchemy lies precisely in its insistence that wholeness requires the conscious integration of both principles. The coniunctio, the sacred marriage, is not the dominance of one partner over the other, but their mutual recognition and cooperation. The Red King must descend into the waters of the White Queen, surrendering his rigid certainty and allowing himself to be dissolved, to die symbolically. The White Queen must accept the fire of the Red King, allowing herself to be heated, solidified, and given definite form. Neither can achieve transformation alone, because each contains precisely what the other lacks. Jung's genius was to recognize in this medieval symbolism a rigorous description of the individuation process. The neurotic is precisely the person in whom one principle has been inflated at the expense of the other, producing an internal tyranny. The goal of therapy is not to strengthen the ego indefinitely, the Red King strategy, nor to dissolve into the unconscious, the White Queen strategy, but to facilitate their dialogue, their mutual transformation, until a third thing emerges, the philosophical gold, the integrated self that transcends the limitations of either pole while incorporating the gifts of both. The alchemical opus was traditionally divided into stages, though different schools enumerated them differently. The most philosophically relevant division for our purposes is the threefold scheme of nigredo, albedo, and rubedo, blackening, whitening, and reddening, which maps directly onto the psychological process of confronting, clarifying, and integrating unconscious material. Nigredo, the descent into darkness. The work begins not with inspiration, but with disillusionment. Nigredo is the stage of putrefaction, of the death of illusions, the collapse of the persona, that mask of social adaptation which we mistake for our true identity. This is what Jung called the confrontation with the shadow, the recognition that we contain precisely those qualities we most despise, that our self-image is a carefully curated fiction, that beneath our conscious intentions lurk motives we dare not acknowledge. For the person identified with the Red King, the rational, achieving, controlling self, Nigredo arrives as a crisis of efficacy. The career stalls, the relationship fails, the body betrays through illness. No amount of strategic thinking can resolve the situation, because the problem is not external but internal. The very qualities that once brought success have now become rigid defenses against authentic life. The Red King discovers that his kingdom is a prison, that his power is brittle, that he has been ruling over a wasteland of his own making. For the person identified with the White Queen, the feeling intuitive, yielding self, Negredo manifests as a crisis of dissolution. There is too much empathy, too much sensitivity, too much porousness to others' needs and emotions. The boundaries have become so diffuse that there is no stable center, only an exhausting series of identifications and emotional inundations. The White Queen discovers that her receptivity has become a kind of slavery, that she has no voice of her own, that she has been consumed by the very fluidity she thought was her essence. The temptation at this stage is to intensify the familiar strategy. The Red King tries harder to control, the White Queen attempts to adapt more perfectly. But Negredo deepens precisely through these efforts because they represent the resistance of consciousness to its necessary death. The alchemical texts speak of the black sun, the midnight consciousness, the encounter with the massa confusa, the confused mass of undifferentiated psychic material that must be faced before any real work can begin. This is the depression that initiates transformation, the necessary darkness that precedes authentic light. Albedo, the purification of consciousness. If Negredo is descent, albedo is distillation. Here begins the actual work of differentiation, of separating what truly belongs to oneself from what has been introjected from parents, culture, and collective opinion. The alchemical operation is called separation or ablution, washing away impurities, clarifying what remains. Psychologically, this is the painstaking process of analysis, examining one's automatic reactions, questioning one's assumptions, distinguishing genuine values from adopted ideologies. For the Red King type, albedo involves learning to stop, to become still, to listen to the quiet voice beneath the constant activity. This is phenomenally difficult for someone whose entire identity rests upon doing, achieving, and controlling. The practice required is counterintuitive: meditation, contemplation, the cultivation of receptivity. The Red King must learn to value the White Queen's gifts, emotional intelligence, intuitive knowing, the capacity to wait and allow rather than constantly forcing outcomes. He must learn, in short, that masculine strength includes the ability to be vulnerable, that true power encompasses the courage to not act, to let things unfold, to trust processes that cannot be controlled. The resistance here is tremendous because it feels like weakness, like betrayal of everything one has worked to achieve. The inner dialogue becomes a war between the old identity and the emerging possibility. Dreams at this stage often feature water, floods, oceans, drowning, because the Red King is learning to swim in the White Queen's element. He is learning that thinking is not the only form of intelligence, that emotions contain wisdom, that the body knows things the mind cannot articulate. For the White Queen type, albedo involves learning to speak, to define boundaries, to say no. This feels equally impossible for someone whose entire identity rests upon accommodation, empathy, and relational harmony. The practice required is assertion, naming one's needs, tolerating others' disappointment, developing the capacity for clear thinking even when it creates conflict. The White Queen must learn to value the Red King's gifts, analytical precision, the capacity for solitude, the courage to stand alone against collective opinion. She must learn that feminine wisdom includes the ability to discriminate, that true compassion sometimes requires severity, that boundaries are not violence but necessary architecture. The resistance here manifests as guilt, as fear of abandonment, as a profound anxiety that claiming one's own center means harming others. Dreams at this stage often feature fire, swords, or masculine figures, sometimes threatening, sometimes helpful, because the White Queen is learning that conflict is not catastrophe, that aggression, rightly directed, serves life, that logos has its own form of love. Rubedo, the emergence of wholeness. The final stage, rubedo, is not a final state, but the beginning of an ongoing dynamic. This is the birth of the philosophical child, the lapis philosophorum, the stone that is not a stone, the gold that is not gold, the self that transcends and includes both king and queen while being reducible to neither. Alchemically, this is represented by the hermaphrodite, the androgyne, the figure who is symbolically both male and female, who has integrated the opposites into a new unity. But we must be clear, This is not fusion, not a blending into undifferentiated sameness. The Red King and White Queen do not disappear in Rubedo. Rather, they become collaborators instead of antagonists. They learn to take turns, to yield leadership depending on what the situation requires, to trust each other's competence in their respective domains. The integrated person does not cease to have moments of decisive action or receptive listening. Rather, these cease to be compulsive extremes and become conscious choices appropriate to context. In practical terms, this looks like a person who can be intellectually rigorous without being emotionally sterile, who can be empathically attuned without losing critical discernment, who can lead when necessary and follow when wise, who can be in the world effectively while remaining connected to inner depth. This person has learned what the alchemists called the circulation, the continuous movement between opposites, the rhythmic breathing of the soul between expansion and contraction, action and reflection, speaking and listening. The hallmark of Rubedo is a certain quality of presence. The individual is no longer internally at war, no longer exhausting themselves maintaining one-sided identification. There is a groundedness, a flexibility, a capacity to respond rather than merely react. Jung called this the achievement of the self, not the ego's self-image, but the totality of conscious and unconscious working in harmony, the psyche as a differentiated whole rather than a collection of warring fragments. Yet even this stage is not static. The alchemist spoke of the opus circulatorium, the circular work, because integration is not achieved once and for all, but must be renewed at each new level of development. What was integrated in one's 30s must be reintegrated in one's 50s, for the challenges change, the neglected opposite shifts, and the work continues until death. The Red King and White Queen are not historical figures, but living dynamics within the psyche. Requiring ongoing conscious attention and ceremonial union, there is a moment in the alchemical work that the texts describe with particular dread. The moment when the opus threatens to fail entirely, when the vessel cracks, when the carefully tended fire goes out and the matter blackens beyond recovery. The medieval alchemists knew this moment practically, the literal explosion of equipment, the loss of materials, years of work reduced to ash. But they also knew it psychologically, the dark night of the soul, the crisis of meaning, the moment when one questions whether any of this effort has point or purpose. This crisis is not incidental, but structural. It represents the moment when the ego realizes that it cannot achieve integration through its own efforts alone, that all its strategies and techniques ultimately amount to another form of control, the Red King trying to dominate the process itself. The very project of self-transformation becomes suspect. Is this not just another ego inflation, another narcissistic pursuit dressed in spiritual language? Is the desire for wholeness itself not simply the ego's refusal to accept its limitations, its mortality, its essential incompleteness? The religious traditions that ran parallel to alchemy understood this moment as the dark night described by Saint John of the Cross, the stripping away of consolations, the loss of certainty, the experience of abandonment by the very transcendent ground one had been seeking. In psychological terms, this is the encounter with the self as something radically other than consciousness, as something that cannot be controlled, manipulated, or achieved, but only surrendered to. For the person who has been working diligently at integration, attending to dreams, doing shadow work, cultivating the neglected opposite, this crisis arrives precisely when they believe they are making progress. The Red King, who has been learning receptivity, suddenly finds himself in a period of complete paralysis, unable to act, his newfound openness having become a kind of passive emptiness. The White Queen, who has been developing assertion, finds herself in situations where every boundary she sets seems cruel, where her clarity feels like violence, where she longs for the old dissolution that at least felt like love. This is not regression, but something more subtle and more devastating. The recognition that the opposites cannot be reconciled, that consciousness and unconscious remain irremediably alien to one another, that the marriage of Red King and White Queen is a fantasy projected onto an indifferent cosmos. The alchemical texts speak of this as the death of the king, the dissolution of sulfur, the moment when the work must be abandoned or transformed at a level the ego cannot comprehend. What emerges in this crisis, if one can endure it without fleeing into distraction, addiction, or premature closure, is a different relationship to the entire project of integration. The realization dawns that wholeness is not an achievement of the ego, but a grace. Not something one creates, but something one allows. Not a goal toward which one strives, but a condition that already exists beneath the ego's frantic efforts to perfect itself. The Red King and White Queen are not two separate entities that must be forced together, but two perspectives on a unity that precedes their apparent opposition. This shifts the entire endeavor from doing to being, from self-improvement to self-acceptance, from the project of becoming whole to the recognition that one has always been whole, albeit unconscious of it. The work continues, but the relationship to the work changes fundamentally. One no longer performs the opus in order to achieve the philosopher's stone, but because the philosopher's stone is already performing itself, and one's conscious participation is simply a way of honoring what is already occurring. The crisis resolves not through finding an answer, but through the recognition that the question itself was malformed. The Red King and White Queen are not problems to be solved, but mysteries to be inhabited. Their tension is not pathology, but the very structure of consciousness, the necessary condition for any experience at all. To be human is to be divided. To be conscious is to stand between opposites. To live is to endure the polarity that the alchemists named and Jung elucidated, but neither created nor can eliminate. What emerges from this crisis is humility. Not the false humility that disguises resentment, but the authentic humility that comes from recognizing one's place in a process larger than oneself. The work continues, but now with a different quality. Less grasping, more gratitude. Less self-concern, more service. Less proving, more presence. What then is the result of this arduous process? What emerges when the Red King and White Queen have endured their conjunction, their mutual death and resurrection? The alchemical texts offer a symbol, the philosopher's stone, the lapis that heals all wounds, transmutes all base metals, grants immortality. But what does this mean psychologically, stripped of medieval mysticism, yet retaining its essential wisdom? The integrated person, if we may use that term without suggesting a final state, exhibits a particular quality that distinguishes them from both the one-sided personality and the merely well-adjusted individual. They possess what might be called conscious polarity, the capacity to hold opposites in tension without either collapsing into identification with one pole or dissociating into intellectual detachment. They can be decisive without being rigid, receptive without being passive, strong without being harsh, tender without being weak. This shows itself practically in several ways. First, in relationship, the integrated person can engage intimately without losing themselves, can maintain boundaries without creating walls, can give without compulsive self-sacrifice, can receive without shame or inflation. The Red King's capacity for autonomy and the White Queen's capacity for connection work in service of a relating that honors both self and other, that neither dominates nor submits, but genuinely encounters. Second, in vocation, the integrated person works with a quality the Germans call Sachlichkeit, a kind of objective devotion to the task itself rather than to the ego gratification the task might provide. They can apply the Red King's discipline and focus while remaining open to the White Queen's intuitive guidance, allowing the work itself to shape the process rather than forcing predetermined outcomes. This produces creativity of a particular kind. Not the manic inspiration of the inflated ego, nor the derivative safety of the overly cautious, but the steady innovation that comes from deep attention combined with technical mastery. Third, in the encounter with meaning, the integrated person no longer requires the universe to conform to their expectations or justify their existence. They have passed through the crisis that reveals all systems as partial, all beliefs as provisional, all certainties as defenses against anxiety, and yet they do not collapse into cynicism or nihilism. Instead, they develop what Jung called religious attitude without religious certainty, the capacity to engage with symbols, rituals, and practices as meaningful without needing them to be literally true, to to participate in the great questions without demanding final answers. The Red King brings to this engagement the capacity for sustained inquiry, for philosophical rigor, for the courage to question even one's own cherished beliefs. The White Queen brings the capacity for participation, for felt sense, for the wisdom that comes through embodiment and relationship rather than through abstract thought alone. Together they create a consciousness that can think deeply and feel deeply, that can analyze without destroying, that can intuit without credulity. But perhaps most importantly, the integrated person develops a capacity for what might be called psychological generosity. Having faced their own shadow, having encountered their own Red King and White Queen in all their conflict and potential harmony, they become less judgmental of others' struggles, less prone to projection, more capable of seeing the humanity in positions they disagree with. This is not moral relativism, but rather the recognition that every person is engaged in their own opus, working with their own particular proportion of sulfur and mercury, fighting their own battles between consciousness and unconscious. The philosopher's stone, then, is not a thing possessed but a way of being in the world, present to oneself and other, conscious of the opposites, yet not paralyzed by them, capable of both discernment and compassion, both solitude and community, both action and stillness. It is the gold that was always there, merely hidden beneath the lead of unconsciousness. The Red King and the White Queen were never separate monarchs awaiting reconciliation. They are the eternal dynamic of consciousness itself, and the gold you seek is simply the awareness that can witness their dance without needing to stop the music.